Welcome to my Seminar 4 presentation on the Ring of Fire. This is Deborah Shannon, and I'm going to tell you all about mining and resource extraction in Northern Ontario. I chose this topic because I felt I really didn't know very much about the Ring of Fire, and I felt like I should. I wanted to know where exactly it's located, why the land is so valuable, how the resources are extracted, and what's the environmental impact of that extraction. I also wanted to know what legal rights surrounding communities had to that land and what potential benefits there might be for those communities. One of the things that I was really curious to learn is what exactly is happening with the Ring of Fire now. So let's start with my first couple of questions. Where is the Ring of Fire? What's in it? And how do you get those resources out? So you can see here that the Ring of Fire is located north of Thunder Bay, and it's really, interestingly, I think, it's located between, there we go, between the diamonds at Attawapiskat at Victor Mine and the gold in Musselwhite Mine. And so actually the first prospectors to check out the Ring of Fire, they weren't looking for what they actually found, they were actually looking for diamonds. What is kind of interesting about this area, as I understand it, is that this area is actually a big depression in the ground, and that depression was caused by a meteor, and when that meteor hit, the impact caused an unusually high concentration of valuable metals to come to the surface, and some of those metals include nickel, copper, and zinc, and that's what the first prospectors found when they came into this area. It's now actually considered to be the most significant mineral find since what was found in the Timmins area in 1909. There we go. Sorry about that. So these are some of the minerals that were found in the Ring of Fire area. And so KWG was the first on the scene, and they found copper and zinc. But then Noront found a really huge deposit of nickel and copper. And the man who was the president of Noront at the time was a really big Johnny Cash fan, and so he named the area Ring of Fire after a Johnny Cash song. The really big find, though, was accomplished by Free West, which is a relatively small company, but they found a massive amount of chromite. And chromite, I guess, is kind of unusual, but there's a lot of it in Zimbabwe and Kazakhstan, and this find in the Ring of Fire rivals the amount that's currently being mined out of those two countries. And I didn't really know what chromite was, so I checked that out, and chromite is turned into a slightly different metal, and that metal is used to make stainless steel and chrome plating. So, all right, well, how much is all of this stuff actually worth? Well, they estimate that there's $10 billion worth of gold in the Ring of Fire, another $10 billion of nickel and copper, and $50 billion worth of chromite. So we're really talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars of resources. I can't even really imagine how much money that is that we're really talking about. So the next logical question to me is, okay, so there's billions and billions and billions of dollars of resources in the land. How do we get those resources out so that we can take advantage of them? And so what needs to happen is resource extraction. And I'll get my pencil back here. So the first thing that needs to happen is the creation of open pit mines. And as you can see in the picture here, open pit mines are huge, and they are not very pretty. And so these mines need to be dug in order to get the resources out. After that, There will also need to be tailing impoundment areas like the one here. It kind of looks okay until you really understand what a tailing is. So synonyms for the word tailings are slimes, tails, refuse, leach residue, or slickens. Those are synonyms for the word tailings. So a tailing is actually the mineral left over after the process of separating the valuable stuff from the uneconomic stuff. And so these impoundment areas, I mean, this is where the leftover stuff gets put. And they're a horrific blight on the landscape. And as we know from the tailings ponds in the oil fields of Alberta, they are hazardous to the environment and to the wildlife. We also, of course, would need to have processing facilities. An example facility is shown here. For the chromite, industry might also choose to construct a smelting plant to process the chromite into ferrochromium. And they might choose to do that because chromite, I guess, is not very easy to transport. And so it costs a lot of money to transport it in its natural state. So again, you can see the processing facility is huge. It's going to require a lot of land, and it's going to require a lot of energy resources, which, by the way, don't currently exist in the Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire is in a really remote region where there is no infrastructure for energy, and also no infrastructure for transportation. So in order to really access this area, roads and or railways would need to be built through that pristine boreal forest, and there would also need to be airstrips in order to transport human resources. So, even assuming that all of this were possible, the question is now, well, whose land is it? And what are the political and ecological ramifications of doing all of the things that I just said? So we know that there's billions of dollars worth of resources there, but we also know that it's going to cost a lot, and not just in terms of money, in order to get those resources out. So we need to understand that the land that we're talking about falls under the James Bay Treaty Number 9, which was signed in 1905. And as we know, the First Nations people who signed these treaties never considered the treaties to be land surrender agreements. The 9 communities, and I have them listed here on the right-hand side, the 9 communities that are most proximate to the Ring of Fire banded together in 2009 and became the Matawa First Nations Council. And they did this so that they could work together to better advocate for their land claims in the region. The communities have a number of concerns, and I've listed them on this slide here. Because of these concerns, the First Nations communities began to block the airstrips, which effectively prevented the mining companies from continuing work in the region. Some of the First Nations communities were demanding ownership of a revamped airport, improved memorandum of understanding with the government, winter road extensions, guaranteed training and jobs, joint panel reviews, and improved environmental impact studies. And those environmental impact studies are really important. An organization called Ontario Nature claims that environmental scans were being rushed by the government to satisfy industry, and there was a belief that development was happening faster than data could be collected on sensitive ecologies and wildlife. Environmentalists and First Nations people were particularly concerned about those inadequate environmental assessment processes, because there was fear that there was inadequate waste management, that pollution of nearby lakes and wetlands would result. There were reports of impact on traditional hunting grounds, and there was concern about there being additional harm to at-risk species such as the woodland caribou, which is pictured here. Okay, so with all this potential for harm, why would we even consider developing these resources? Well, we have to remember that the communities that are involved in the Matawa First Nation are impoverished. In Webekwe, for example, 80% of the population live on welfare, and there's almost a 100% unemployment rate. And the water is not drinkable, there are housing shortages, and a high suicide rate among young people. So there's a real need for economic development in these communities. Government and industry quickly realized that if they wanted to profit from these natural resources, they were going to have to negotiate with the First Nations. The Regional Framework Agreement between Mattawa and government was signed in 2014. While the agreement itself is mainly a promise of mutual cooperation and discussion, the Ministry of Natural Development and Mines lists more specifically exactly what the First Nations communities should receive if they do not hinder this development. So let's look at a few of these items a little bit more closely. One of the things that First Nations should expect to receive, assuming that they play the game, is community-based capacity funding. And really what this means is that funding will be available to the community to make the community more independent and better able to make decisions and negotiate with industry on such huge projects. Also, there would be funding set aside for land use planning. So notice especially the clause here about traditional ecological knowledge, which I thought was really interesting considering what we've learned in our class so far. And also this idea of protecting areas of cultural and ecological value. Employment and income assistance, skills development, training, and job creation. Again, this is something that the First Nations are advocating for, and it's very important. Attawapiskat, for example, had an agreement with De Beers about employing people from the community in the Victor mine. The problem was few people in the community actually had their grade 12, which is an industry requirement. So although that was built into their impact benefit statement, Attawapiskat wasn't actually able to profit from that. And so this is something that the First Nations have learned, and so they recognize that they need to have skills development and training brought into their community so that members of the community can take advantage of the jobs that industry could potentially offer them. Regional infrastructure planning. This again is critical. So what's interesting is that my department at the college, I work in the academic upgrading department for regional workforce development, and it's my job to help people get their grade 12 equivalency. And I actually teach online, but I have one big barrier. And the barrier is that often the communities that need me the most don't have internet. So I think that this regional infrastructure planning will really be critical for those more northern and remote communities to be able to benefit. The socioeconomic and community development supports that are being offered really fall into three major areas: the economic development supports, family wellness and well-being, and education, skills development, and training. To me, this was the most surprising statement, and I thought it was, I guess I was surprised because I found it almost unusually clear, but there was a statement about resource revenue sharing, and the statement, exactly quoted, is First Nations and industry see government resource revenue sharing discussions as a necessary precursor to advancing the development of the Ring of Fire and bringing about stability and investor certainty. Ontario is prepared to work with those First Nation communities most proximate to the Ring of Fire development to negotiate a specific share equivalent to a portion of the province's resource revenues associated with new mines in the Ring of Fire region. We anticipate that sharing these new revenues with First Nations will create a strong incentive to promote local development opportunities. I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so great. Let's assume that environmental concerns can be put to rest with the appropriate environmental assessments and consultations, and let's assume that enough land is going to be conserved so that local wildlife will not be adversely affected. Why aren't these First Nations communities rolling in the profits of this billion-dollar industry? Well, the Northern Policy Institute published a very insightful report in January of 2016, and here's just a piece from their executive summary. In the early 2010s, Northwestern Ontario seemed to be on the verge. I'm sorry, that should say in the early 2000s. Northwestern Ontario seemed to be on the verge of a major mining boom, with 9 projects in particular seen as having the best chance of reaching the commercial production stage. It seemed possible that a total of 14 mines could be operating in the region by the end of 2018. So far, however, none of the 9 projects with resource wealth valued in 2012 at over $135 billion US, with potential tax revenues exceeding $16 billion Canadian, and predicted to create over 23,000 direct, indirect, and induced new employment positions, has begun commercial operation. So none of the 9 projects has actually begun commercial operation, and only 3 might be operational by 2018. So the question is why? Why are we at a standstill? Well, the first reason probably is that in 2009 there was a collapse of international commodities market. A lot of people seem to think that the standstill is due entirely to First Nations stubbornness and perhaps also government ineptitude, and that's what caused Cliffs to pull out. But the truth is there's a variety of factors that are causing delays. The last point here is really critical. Although there are billions of dollars of resources in the Ring of Fire, it's also going to cost billions of dollars to get those resources out. So if profit margins are not high enough to offset the costs and the associated risks, then investors in industry will pull out. Economists suggest that by 2018, the value of chromite may have risen again along with other commodities, and so the truth is we may just have to wait a few years yet to see this development actually take place. So I guess the question is, should we just give up then if all of these things, the high taxes and the need to foster collaboration between communities and the volatility of commodities markets, if all of these things are such a barrier to profiting from those natural resources, maybe it's not worth it. My question is how can we move forward? And so that report that I spoke of also suggested some solutions. So one of the solutions suggests that now is a good time to invest. Projects might be on hold, but the resources aren't going anywhere. At some point, someone is going to be willing to pay to extract them. We just might have to wait for the commodities market to bounce back. But right now, interest rates are low. And so we should invest in infrastructure and energy transmission, and we should incentivize students to train in mining so that you have the infrastructure and the human resources in place when the commodities market rises again. It's also a good time to put processes in place to ensure efficient consultations so that no one feels that assessments are being rushed or glossed over. So I think that this is critical in terms of shortening the environmental permitting process so that companies feel like there's efficient methods to get those permits through, but so that First Nations people and environmentalists don't feel that things are being rushed just to make industry happy. It's critical to build relations with the First Nations people. And I feel like, especially because projects are on hold right now, creating those partnerships now is critical to show that we're partners in good faith and that we agree on we agree that the concessions that were made are crucial to any community and not just to a community sitting on top of a gold mine. I think that there's hope on the horizon. I feel that the election of the Trudeau Liberal government is a good sign. They have reaffirmed a $1 billion commitment to build strategic transportation infrastructure, and Trudeau has pledged to improve the economies of northern communities. I think in part towards that, there was a joint investment with the federal government where almost $1 million was pledged to enable 4 of those communities that are in the Matawa First Nation to work together to complete a community service corridor study. And that's something that's just happened. So here are the references that that I went through. I will say that especially helpful was the Ontario Ministry of Northern Development and Mines website, and also the Northern Policy Institute report. I hope that you found my report educational and somewhat interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing what other people have put together as well.